Before I became interested in political philosophy, I was interested in two seemingly opposed forms of philosophy. One came from my interest in anthropology, although I must admit, my interest in anthropology was more physical and forensic than it was cultural. But I realized through looking into physical anthropology that I did need an understanding of culture to understand the evidence that I was looking at. That those two things, the biological and the cultural, the innate and the habitats, are in, for lack of a better term, dialectical tension, that they both emerge and play roles in the individual. But that led me to look into religious anthropology, believe it or not, to figure out what kind of decisions and incentives religious structures and mental thought structures did to actually incentivize certain kinds of development. I got into the work of David Sloan Wilson. I got into the work of Marshall Solins, um, to a lesser degree, the work of David Graeber, which I now quite famously reject. But I was going along that path in one direction. And the other path I went, however, was philosophy of science. Because I understand what religion was, and the more I studied anthropology, the harder that became to do. To understand what we talk about when we talk about religion, we're not talking about the post-Christian European world. It's a lot of a more of a murky issue than people think, because law often emerges in these religious communities as quasi-state forms without even formal states existing. So figuring out what religion is, I went to try to figure out its opposite, science. um, I learned about the Lacanian method. I learned about the divisions in the demarcation question, are where science ends and other things begin. And it was the work of Massimo Pigliucci that really got me to realize that there was a spectrum of what could be called science, and there was a spectrum of what could be called reason. There were things that were unreasonable, i.e., they were incoherent with their prior assumptions, but there wasn't one form of reason that dominated everything. I looked at the development of dialectical reason and different forms of modal logics. Now, this is what I did in undergrad. I was that kind of nerd, and I was also a lit major, so I was reading a bunch of literature, and the two things seemed all tangled up in my head. Now, this is a weird thing for a former working class kid to worry about. My parents never thought about any of that shit. But my stepfather, who had come from a somewhat wealthy background that lost all their wealth, and he himself was a blue collar individual, was a mechanic. Um, he would complain about intellectuals and their lack of epistemic humility. He didn't use that word; that's my word. Um, because they wouldn't listen to workers who'd actually often figured a lot of this stuff out, but didn't have systemic ways to explain it. The workers knew it in the context of what they did, and that often workers saw cascade failures, another word that I would use that he probably wouldn't. Not that he wouldn't understand it, though. I still alive. I probably should. He wouldn't understand it. He would say that they were constantly not seeing the next two steps ahead of them. So getting my head around science was actually, okay, why aren't people listening to that? Why don't they see the next two steps ahead of them? Science is what exactly? It's not just engineering. In fact, sometimes engineering is not particularly scientific. We often conclude something to work, as in just respond to various engineering challenges in a way that responds to failures without really understanding the system that we built. And in social systems, that's even more true and almost inevitable. So we ask ourselves then, what is a demarcation of science? And the issue with social sciences was not that they didn't have experiments or historical reliability, both were kind of important for science, but that their generalizations were often false, the replication crisis isn't the first time we've had a crisis in social science around this. They are based on priors that assume a status quo is static most of the time. That people are the way we see them right now, and their incentive structures will be consistent and reducible to simple things. The problem then was, like religion, I actually couldn't figure out where the true demarcation line was between science and non-science. People will say psychoanalysis is a science. It uses no modern scientific methods. Yet, there are things discovered by Lacan, such as the metaphase, that are real and neurologically verified. Is it a science, a pseudoscience, like Karl Popper said, because it was unfalsifiable and the ideas would just change kind of willy-nilly as speculations to make the entire symbolic system work? Or was it something in between, a proto-science or something on the science spectrum? So I went through the various theories of science. Karl Popper, bless his communist, anti-communist heart, his communist-hating heart, and I'm a Southerner, so you know what bless your heart means, got me thinking about falsification, but then probability hurt that. But Popper did point out, and as I quoted in reading in another one of these solos, After Virtue by Lester McIntyre, that if I can articulate perfectly a social idea, engineering invention, or a social arrangement, before it happens, then I've invented the social arrangement and it's happening now. So there is no way to pre-invent or partially invent something. Yet inventions emerge concurrently from the data that is available in the world. Now, this can lead to a teleological view, but things also fall apart predictably, and digital decay happens, and the cascade effects cause things we do not see. So I went through having only a family resemblances notion of religion. Dharmic religions do not function like Abrahamic religions. Pre-modern religious beliefs, even in the Abrahamic world, do not function the same way as post-liberal ones that emerge specifically from a Christian context, etc., etc., etc. But I also realized that no, the scientific method doesn't define all sciences. There is not one scientific method. There are rigorous methodologies. No, it is not rigorous common sense, as Elaine Sokol tried to say. There's nothing commonsensical about where a lot of the rigor actually takes you, nor the methodology is completely clear. Nor should we assume that elegance, our parsimony, our Occam's razor is always true. It's a good heuristic for truth, but we don't even agree what simplification means in all contexts. What is the exact variable that needs to be simple? Now, this led me later on, as I became a Marxist, to the question of Marxism as a science. Now, I know the word Wissenschaft in German means something more like logic or law than what we think of as natural sciences. But that was also appeals to science as understood in the 19th century, not just in Germany, but also in English, because Marx had lived in England and Engels was pretty fluent. And they shared some of the positivistic notions of the day, but not just that. There was a dialectical edge to Marx that he realized certain kinds of limits, which is why he thought utopian socialism, while it may have been necessary and even somewhat good to give you an orienting vision towards the future, was still ultimately impossible because it did not root itself in any scientific notion of the future. And that's also why Marx was very hesitant, besides certain points, the abolition of wage labor, the end of classes, to say what even his future society would look like, except that as classless, it would eventually wither away the state and be based off such abundance that we'd not need to monitor man hours and compensate on hours, all that all that much eventually. That is the implication in Critique of the Goethe Program, where he speaks the most clearly about this. But we have to remember the Critique of the Goethe Program was a draft note not meant for the public, and only made public after the Goethe Program was rejected, and not by Marx, but by Engels. Which got me thinking about the claim that Marxism was the immortal science, because it is often based on people claiming that we can figure out hard rules, not even probabilistic rules, but hard rules from the past. But any good Hegelian, and Marx and Engels both knew this, knows that Hegel wasn't claiming the past was totally predicted the future, but that they rhymed, that the developmental incentives were always there. And Marx's big chastising of Hegel in some ways, in the Critique of the Philosophy of Right, was about assuming that the current society was going to be the ultimate manifestation of freedom, as articulated in Hegel's view about liberal elements of Prussia. We have to ask ourselves then, if history rhymes, what does that mean? And if we don't know what science is, what does it mean to say Marxism is scientific? Well, that led me to the work of Amri Lakatos, who worked with Popper, who talked about research programs and each system having a set of internal rigor that is understandable and an agreed upon set of terms. And once they degenerate, again, it is still hard to go about any predictive manner. And we see this in Marxism. Almost no key term in Marxism is uncontested by Marxists. What do they mean? And so there's a limit to our ability to communicate any generalizability here, because we even don't agree on the terms and the meaning of what we are generalizing. Take the term proletariat, or what productive means. Now, I actually think it's very clear when you read Capital Volume 2 and 3 and Theories of Surplus Value that productivity is productiveness to bourgeois surplus and surplus value, and that is about making money. And Marx even talks about teachers being non-productive labor when they work for the state, because they live off the dividends of taxes, which is off the wage form. It doesn't generate new surplus, versus when they work for a private school and they generate surplus for the capitalist. He was not valorizing one over the other. Education for him was socially necessary. Nonetheless, one was productive and one wasn't. Now, people go and use those passages to argue that Marx thought that productivity was the definition of the proletariat, but then you have to ignore both the problems of circulation and taking advantages of circulation and time generating surplus, which is not about productivity, and the way finance capital delays that both parasitically and productively, depending on the time period and how much capital it's sucking up. Right now, I think we are in a very parasitic time period of finance capital, but in general, we aren't always in that time period, and it goes back and forth. Furthermore, the generalizability got turned towards the future. Now, Marx did this himself. In the 1850s, he predicted a clash that would lead to a worldwide revolution, something that he gives up. I got in an indirect argument, and a direct argument with Tom O'Brien, and an indirect argument with Andrew Kleiman, claiming that Marx didn't mean what he said there, because some small technicality in wording they could interpret to say, oh, he never predicted immiseration. But it's pretty clear to every common reader of the text that that is what he predicted. And the ambiguities in Marx's text, even the most orthodox Marxists tend to fill in with what they want to believe. That's true with the ambiguities of any text, which is partly why people like Stephen Jay Gould said if Marxism was to be a science, it would be like evolution, and we would not be referring back purely to the text. Those terms would be clarified in practice. Now, that gets us to the practice part of Marxism, but the generalizability is still a problem. We keep on trying to deduce from the past what we can do in the future. And while I do think we learn from the past, there's no firm, hard, royal road there. You cannot replicate everything from a prior social situation, be it the Bolshevik Revolution or the emergence of FDR, just by fidelity to ideas or even policies that emerged out of it, because you do not live in the overall social and material context from which those rules emerged. Nor can you know them all, at least right now. So, while we can use history as a guide, the idea that we can use it as a generalizable thing to predict laws, a la Peter Turchin's Cleodynamics through mathematical modeling, etc., would imply that we know all the factors that go into a social arrangement. We do not know all the factors that go into subatomic particles, the smallest forms of matter, and thus the simplest, although they seem infinitely complex. How do you think things of orders of magnitude and additional complexity, like even a human body or human society, can be measured in the same way? The number of calculations necessary may be impossible to do, and we don't even know that we understand the world enough to make sure our math truly maps onto it. Sometimes we create categories just to make the math work. See something like ether. My point in all this is that there's a lot of Marxists who will claim to know the future without doing the work. And then we do not hold them accountable for the falseness of their predictions. And we do not even ask if what they're doing is truly scientific. Are they including everything in the set they need to include? Are there ideological or personal or biographical reasons stopping them from looking? And that's just not true with Marxists, but Marxists do, in general, make the claim of having a science that has predictive capacity in a teleologically smooth way. Frankly, my father used to laugh at those kinds of things, my stepfather. He thought that such things were hubristic and that workers knew better. Marx, ironically, kind of did understand this, even though he aimed to build a predictive science. There's ambiguity there. There's hesitancy. And people have picked up on this in reading Marx all the way back to the Second International, but definitely close readers starting in the 60s and 70s both used it and abused it to say Marx didn't mean what he said. And we still see this today with people using Mega 2 research to reinterpret Marx in ways that are inconsistent with other passages. But we shouldn't expect consistency from someone trying to be intellectually honest and work out these ideas. After all, Marx warned us against blueprints for the future, and this is part of why. You cannot conceptually generalize from the present everything that will be in the future until those things exist, which is why there's a limit from the predictability of science fiction and everything else. So a lot of this is in the blurry demarcation in between science and non-science here. Because that line that we all want to have a hard and clear line going all the way back to the positivist, which I will remind you, many started out as Marxists, both the logical positivist and the logical empiricist later who emerged from them when the logical positivists defeated their own project. After all, they argued that verifiability was nearly impossible. They're the people who argued it. And they're also the people who showed later on, and when Karl Popper was popular, how probability messed up falsifiability. That there is still some way in which some counterfactual or some factor that you don't know exists can emerge and change all your predictive apparatus. So we need more epistemic humility. When leftists are constantly predicting either great economies or recessions, we often do not know the interaction of all the factors involved. Then we try to deduce from those complicated economic situations entire likely categories. Now, we can game theoretic this out, or we can work through the logical implications of what is most likely to happen given the structure of capital and the incentives within it. But what we cannot say for sure is that we know all the variables, all of what Heinrich Grossman would call the counteracting tendencies. So we have a lot of tendency laws, which aren't laws, because they are tendencies. I do believe that there is a tendency of the rate of profit to fall, but is it a law? There are other things that mitigate that, including the ability to mitigate that through the liquidity of currency. But that is based on complications of human interaction and policy that is hard to predict. And the way that interacts in the global market is also hard to predict. And Marxian economists have made wildly opposed predictions, all of which have often been wrong. For example, the imminent collapse of the dollar has been predicted for a long time and not happened. Yes, there is de-dollarization going on, but it's not imminent. It is going to be a slow, long process. But they are drawing on priors. And as you get older, your priors seem more clear to you. You have more history and justification for them. But it also makes you less likely to see when something truly new emerges. So, for example, I'm getting less and less willing to make predictions about the economy or politics, even though I have a pretty good track record of prediction prior. But I continually don't see small things. This is necessary to have a realistic politics. This is why talking about things like the demarcation between these ideas, religion on one hand and science on the other, is a much harder thing than you can see. By the way, in general, while religiosity has decreased, 50% of young people do not go to church, and most do not identify with a consistent religion if they are under 40. We also see beliefs in religious miracles, even amongst the educated, increase to about 61% across the board in all social classes and strata in the United States, indicating the idea, the theological assumption, that a more secular world would emerge from education and the statement of religions being opposed to science is just false. Religion is going away, but it's not rationality and science, whatever you think you mean by that. It is replacing it. Furthermore, we have to start holding our pundits and economists and whatnot more accountable for making bad predictions or from extrapolating poorly from good ones. I remember all the MMTers and post-Keynesians of the Minsky type in the teens predicting radical independence and trying to tell me what Syriza was going to do and how this would fundamentally change Europe and Greece. Yet, game theoretically, they were ignoring the obvious, which was that Greece was negotiating from a weak position if they left in terms of getting capital investment for strengthening their own currency, or if they stayed in terms of how the Troika would discipline them, which we saw either way, and it was a damned if you do, damned if you don't moment. And game theory would predict that Syriza would turn on each other in that scenario, and they did. But I don't know for sure, and I can't know for sure if other things could have been possible at that time. They're not possible now because the past has now happened. So this idea that we have hard laws to predict the future teleologically is just an act of faith. And while I actually think the tendency to belittle faith is a problem, this is the kind of faith of which there is very little reason to believe at this point. You will not solve the questions of materiality by references to texts of human ideas alone. So there's a limit to our generalizations in the realm of the social being predictive about the future, because we do not know and cannot know every single relevant and objective part that leads to the emergence. And you do not settle that with references to text. Like and subscribe, protect your peace. We have a Patreon where you can get more. Have a great day.